Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today's topic is about the struggle between good and evil, a struggle that's more commonly seen in speculative fiction works thanks to the way they exaggerate reality and the fact that they take place in a made-up setting that you can change however you want. In real-world fiction, you can depict big events like terrorist attacks or plane crashes, but with a fictional setting, your characters can defeat an evil empire and redraw the political map, or they can literally change the world with something like earth magic or terraforming. Something else you can do with speculative fiction is create villains who are completely unapologetically evil by having them do things like bomb cities with nuclear warheads, raid and burn villages, hold the world hostage with a weather controller, or make deals with literal demons. Or maybe the bad guys are literal demons and the good guys are angels. However, when you build a conflict between good and evil into your setting, you should first stop and ask yourself, just how bad should the bad guys be? Answering that question won't be as simple as you might expect. Begin with a definition. Step 1 to deciding how evil to make your villains is figuring out what evil means to you. Personally, I would define evil as any action or intention that actively harms others for the sake of your personal benefit. Now, that's a pretty generalized description. There are a lot of caveats and exceptions and further definitions I could offer to fully flesh things out, but if I did that, it would take up the rest of the video. The point I'm making is not to figure out what my definition of evil is, it's to figure out what your definition of evil is. What is the difference between good people and evil people? Is it possible for a person to be irredeemably evil, or is there both good and evil inside all of us? Are people basically good, or basically bad? Is there a distinction between evil and selfishness, or are they just different amounts of the same thing? How responsible is a person for their own actions, and how responsible is their upbringing and the society that surrounds them? Can good people become evil, or evil people become good? You don't have to answer all of these questions in detail or write out a big essay about the nature of evil, but considering these questions will help you figure out how you want to portray evil in your speculative setting. With that in mind, you should consider writing down in a short sentence what evil means to you, and then, if it's different, what evil means in your setting. That will give you a place to start when you begin to flesh out the demonic forces, evil empires, or greedy corporations that your setting features. Understand your audience and genre limits. Once you have an idea about the nature of evil, at least in the context of your fictional setting, you should think about the kind of audience you want your works to reach and what kind of evil portrayals they'd be comfortable with. This is where genre selection can come in handy, because choosing a story genre for your speculative work can help you set expectations and aim your story at the right audience. For instance, if you're aiming your work at children or young adults, the evil you depict should probably focus on less harmful crimes like theft, or more fantastical threats like giant battles between good and evil, or superhero fights where the main characters only rarely get injured or killed. On the other hand, if you want to write an adult horror story, then you can go absolutely nuts with things like murder, child abuse, rape, cannibalism, and all the other terrible things that people have done to each other over the years. The bad guys in your setting should reflect not only your personal understanding of evil, but also the kind of evil actions that your audience is expecting. Now, let's go over a few basic categories. Cartoonish evil. As you might guess from the name, cartoonish evil is so exaggerated and overwrought that it stops being worrying or horrifying and instead becomes silly and laughable. Elmer Fudd is evil because he's trying to kill Bugs Bunny, but he's so inept and gullible that it really takes the fangs out of what he's trying to do. Plus, nobody ever bleeds out or dies when he shoots his gun. In the show Phineas and Ferb, Dr. Doofenshmirtz is an evil scientist who constantly tries to take over the tri-state area, but his inventions always have strange and silly functions. He's always foiled before he can do anything permanent, and he's a pretty nice guy when he isn't at work. Another way a villain can be cartoonishly evil is with melodrama. A melodrama is a story that's sensational and bombastic, and the characters are supposed to be stereotypes that chew the scenery, rather than any sort of realistic depiction of people. Melodramatic villains are evil for the sake of being evil, and they target the heroes either because that's just what villains do, or because they think the heroes wronged them in some minor way. A lot of Shakespeare's plays have melodramatic villains, or at least they can be, depending on the production. Of course, cartoonish evil is not necessarily the same thing as kid-friendly evil. A lot of horror movies feature cartoonish evil, even though they also feature a lot of blood, guts, and flying body parts. Freddy Krueger from the Nightmare on Elm Street series is a good example of this, since in many of the films he constantly cracks jokes and kills his victims in the most over-the-top ways possible. They may be called horror movies, but a lot of the Nightmare films are more like gruesome comedies. Shocking evil. Sometimes, you want the evil people of your setting or story to just slap the audience in the face with how horrifying they are. The soldiers of the evil empire don't just burn villages, they rape the women, enslave the children, and then pile the heads of everyone who's left in a big pyramid to warn the next town. The evil corporation doesn't just ignore environmental concerns, they cause environmental disasters so that they can make money by cleaning them up. Those backwoods hillbillies aren't just unfriendly to strangers, they'll rape you, torture you, and then eat what's left of you for supper. The point of shocking evil is to go beyond the boundaries of good taste in order to provoke a strong reaction from your audience, although the nature of this reaction can depend on the author and the work in question. Maybe you want your audience to take action and do something about the evils you depict that happen in real life. Maybe you want to titillate someone who has a very particular fetish, but the common sense or common decency not to act on it in real life. Maybe you like trolling your audience, and the angry comments from upset mothers that you receive are what makes you happy. Or maybe you want to create a catharsis moment where someone noble goes through all kinds of horrible experiences but never succumbs to despair. Just be careful about how many lines you cross at once, because if you go too far, you may end up sliding into cartoonish evil by accident. Regretful evil. Sometimes, a good person has to make bad decisions for the best reasons. Choose the lesser of two evils. Torture a terrorist for information. Assassinate a world leader before you can start a war, that sort of thing. Regretful evil has the opportunity to create compelling villains, because people in real life sometimes have to compromise their ideals and commit actions they dislike because all of the alternatives seem less positive or less likely to work. By using this kind of evil, it allows the protagonists, and by extension the audience, to understand where the bad guys are coming from and why their actions might seem reasonable from their points of view. Regretful evil allows you to take your story in several interesting directions. Maybe the hero is someone who hasn't compromised their morals the way the villain has, and so the villain acts as a kind of a dark mirror. Maybe the hero will eventually agree that the villain has the right idea and will join them. Maybe the hero will redeem the villain by showing that there's a better way. Or maybe the villain will sacrifice themselves to defeat a bigger threat, since they think that's the only way they can find redemption. The main thing about regretful or supposedly necessary evil is that there isn't that much difference between the hero and the villain. One word of warning though. Don't use the sentence, "We are not so different, you and I," in your work. Even if it's true in your case, it's really overused. Sociological evil. Even if you believe that every person is ultimately responsible for their own actions, there's no getting around the fact that culture and the family that people grow up with will do a lot to define their personalities, their values, their opportunities, and the kinds of evil actions they might engage in. A rich person won't mug a pedestrian on the street because they aren't so desperate that they have to, and a poor person won't defraud a bank because they don't have the trust or the wealth you need to do so. A work that depicts sociological evil acknowledges the fact that the nation, family, and culture that people live in will influence the kinds of evil actions that villains and protagonists engage in. Batman and his rogues gallery have often been used to point this out. While the death of his parents was tragic, Bruce Wayne lives a privileged life thanks to his vast personal wealth and corporate empire, and he uses his wealth to fund his crime-fighting apparatus. Meanwhile, a lot of his enemies are poor, desperate, mentally ill, and don't see any way out of their situation except to steal or hurt others. And then some rich guy comes along to break half their bones and throw them in jail when he could be investing in the city's infrastructure, supporting effective charities, and stumping for politicians who want to improve the social safety net. I know that's not the only way to interpret Batman, but you get my point. Works that feature sociological evil point out that the incentives to perform evil actions often come from culture, lack of privilege, lack of money, lack of mental illness treatments, and other factors that are outside of an individual's control. This means there can be a lot of overlap between sociological evil and regretful evil, but works that feature sociological evil tend to be tragic since it's not very likely that an individual will reform society, and it's much more likely that society will crush the individual. Still, one of the benefits of working with speculative fiction is that you can invent your own societies, and then have your characters change them. Political evil. I personally recommend against using political evil in your works, or at least the version of political evil that I'm about to describe. It never really adds to a story, and at best, all you're really doing is high-fiving the audience members who share your specific political views and alienating everyone else. However, I'm going to describe it anyway for the sake of completion, and so that you understand why you should probably avoid using it. Political evil is where you create villains or other characters who hamper the protagonists because they happen to hold political views that you, the author, don't like. Maybe it's a pacifist who's standing in the way of a hero who wants to use justifiable force. Maybe it's a neo-Nazi who has no personality outside of shouting Heil Hitler. Or maybe it's a moderate who says, let's meet in the middle, when you believe that one side is completely wrong. When you write a character whose politics you despise, you will almost always write them as a straw man who is incapable of doing anything aside from making the protagonist look good by comparison. If you're going to create an unrealistic villain, then at least make it a cartoonish villain so that everyone in your audience can have fun. Protagonist evil. Protagonist evil is where evil gets real complicated. The words protagonist and hero don't have the exact same meaning because the point of view character, the protagonist, can sometimes be the villain of the story, or at least the villain of someone's story. You can find plenty of works in which protagonists make bad decisions, wrestle with their morals, or choose the lesser of two evils, but what I'm talking about in this segment is what happens when you take that to the next level. Falling Down is a movie about a white-collar worker who gets sick and tired of all the frustrations of modern society and decides to finally do something about them. Or at least that's how it is at first. As the movie progresses, the protagonist starts getting more and more violent and reacts to smaller and smaller issues, and meanwhile the police following his trail find out that he has a history of violent episodes, including one that got him fired. At the end of the film, the protagonist and the author realize that he is the bad guy of the story. Then there's the movie Lord of War, which is about a gun runner who doesn't like his job but who realizes that if he doesn't do it, someone else will take his place. Another way people use evil protagonists is by pitting them against villains who are even worse. For instance, Megamind is a movie about a supervillain who plays his role because that's what society expects from him. But then he accidentally gives superpowers to a horrible human being and ends up becoming the hero by stopping him. In the TV show Dexter, Dexter Morgan is a serial killer, but he makes a point of targeting violent criminals rather than innocent victims. This difference of degree allows the audience to root for the protagonists in spite of their questionable morals. If your setting is unrealistic and stylized, then cartoonish villains are probably a better fit. If you want your setting to say something about the real world, then put in villains with reasonable motives and societies with negative qualities like inequality, racism, and slavery. Understanding the nature of evil, or at least your personal concept of evil, can be uncomfortable, but it can also be very rewarding for both you and your future audience. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.